and we are continuing our inquiry into the Middle East. We have great pleasure of the Middle East Minister in front of us today, and Stephen Hickey, who is the Director of Middle East and North Africa at FCDO. Thank you so much for coming in. You probably know that we have ourselves just come back from the region, where we had a series of meetings. We went to Saudi Arabia, to Jordan, to the West Bank, and to Israel. And this is a subject that is of huge interest to us and to our constituents. So it's fantastic to have the opportunity to speak to you today, Minister. Can I just begin, if you don't mind, just clearing up something which arose from our trip, just to get it out of the way? Would you expect, Minister, if there was a visiting delegation of members of Parliament to the House of Commons, for the delegation to be videoed without their knowledge or consent?
If someone was visiting the House of Commons?
Yes.
Certainly not. I would think that'd be very unusual.
Or for it to be put onto Instagram and indeed briefed to, let's say, the Daily Telegraph in disparaging terms.
I'm not familiar with the details, but clearly if someone was visiting the House of Commons, we'd want to show them
And it would be
courtesy.
particularly bad, wouldn't it, if it was the Deputy Foreign Minister of Israel who would be videoed in the UK and for disparaging comments to be made about her evidence or her private meeting that she'd had, let's say, with us. Because the opposite has just happened to us. And a video of us at the Knesset meeting, the Deputy Foreign Minister, has been posted on Instagram. We understand that, certainly we had no knowledge that it was being videoed and assumed, of course, that it would never happen. And I have to say, I've just found out about it. And to say that I'm cross might be an understatement. There were many things said in the Knesset by many members of the Knesset that we found quite provocative and indeed, if I'm really honest, quite insulting. And the attitude of some of the members of the Knesset were remarkably rude. And we did our utmost to keep decorum at all times and to remain polite and restrained. But I do think this takes it to another level. And I would ask the Foreign Office to investigate this, please, and to find out why this has happened, who made the decision, and to ask them to take it down and to apologise.
Chair, thank you for bringing it to my attention. It's obviously the first I've heard about it. I'll look into it and come back to the committee.
Thank you very much. Right, having got that off my chest. We have a series of questions, and I wondered if it was all right if the bulk of our questions are going to be about Israel and Palestine, but we would like, if we have time, to also ask you a few questions, perhaps at the end, on Syria and on Iran. I wondered if I could kick off with some sort of general political questions. In your view, why is Israel refusing to move on to stage 2 of the ceasefire deal?
Well, Chair, I don't want to seem evasive, but
Yes.
it's clear that at this very moment there are detailed talks between various parties in relation to Phase 2, and I wouldn't want to speculate on how those talks are going. Our position is clear. We want to get through all 3 phases of the ceasefire. We want to bring this conflict in Gaza, which has had such terrible consequences both for Israelis and Palestinians, to an end. So we do want to see a move into Phase 2. I'm not really in a position to be able to speculate on the very latest from the Israeli side.
Have you heard? Have there been discussions around the possibility that it is because Netanyahu needs to keep his government going until the end of March, when he's going to have a budget before the Knesset, and in order to keep the government going, he has to pass that budget? And obviously the concern would be, if they move to stage 2, that there would be individuals within the government who might withdraw their support. So the best thing for him to do is to keep things going until then and get his budget passed.
Chair, for reasons you understand, I wouldn't want to be drawn into providing too much commentary about internal Israeli politics. I recognise for the Israeli side that Phase 2 is complicated and difficult, and you can see from the public statements of various different Israeli ministers that there clearly is a range of views within the coalition government about phase 2. All I can say is that the UK's position is that we should be moving to phase 2. We have a ceasefire deal on the table. We want to get through all 3 phases of it.
Okay, so can I ask you perhaps then, rather than speculation, maybe if I ask you a factual question, do we know whether the Americans really have agreed to an extension of Part 1 of the ceasefire until the end of Passover? Have we, the British, seen that agreement?
I'm sorry to be tricky about it, but the Americans are literally there right now having these talks, and they are, I think, you can see both from the language from their hostage envoy and from their Middle East envoy that there's clearly quite a lot going on at the moment. So I don't think I can tell you concretely where they've got to in the very latest in the talks.
No, I understand that, but there's a there was a deal, there was a ceasefire deal, and by now we're supposed to be in Part 2. And Part 2 has obligations on the Israelis to withdraw forces and to work towards a permanent solution. And that has stuttered to a halt. But Netanyahu at least is saying that he is extending Part 1 unilaterally because the Americans have agreed that that's what he should do. Now, as a party with interest, as a country with interest in the region, have we seen such an amendment to the ceasefire agreement?
Well, as you say, that we're behind where we should be according to the original agreement. We should be in phase 2 rather than phase 1, and fighting hasn't resumed. So there has de facto been an extension of phase 1. The precise terms of what an extension to phase 1 might look like, I think, has not been determined or decided. So there clearly are hostages that were envisaged originally to be released in phase 2, not least Avinatan Or, who has a British mother who I saw recently. So we watch very carefully. We are interested parties. We want to reach a stage where Avinatan and indeed all the other hostages are released. Of course we do. And if that could be done before phase 2, we would be only too delighted. That I probably can't provide, I'm afraid, detailed commentary on whether or not an agreement has been made to bring the hostage releases forward into phase 1, or whether or not there's a wait to get into phase 2. I think this is some of what is under discussion at this moment.
So if the Americans have agreed to extend phase 1, we haven't been told about that?
Well, as I say, practically we are in an extension of phase 1. The conflict hasn't restarted, and we're clearly not in phase 2, so we're still in phase 1.
What's the purpose of the conference in June? There's a conference, isn't there, that the French and the Saudi Arabians are going to be holding. Could you help us with what the purpose of that is? Is it that the French are considering recognising Palestine and announcing that in June?
So I think the purpose of the June conference from the Saudis and the French is to try and advance a two-state solution. I think it's still being considered by the French and the Saudis how you might approach that conference. We support the conference and we'll be looking to play our full part, but I couldn't tell you what's on the agenda yet because that's for the French and the Saudis, I think.
Could this be a moment when a coalition of nations, the French and the British, the Australians, various other nations, come together as Western nations and recognise the Palestinian state and perhaps start engaging properly with the Arab League's initiative on the rebuilding of Gaza?
So we are engaging properly on the Arab initiative. We've put out a statement with the French and Germans welcoming the Arab proposal. I've been engaged quite closely with my Arab counterparts in its development. We think it is a plan with real merits, and we think it is a good starting point for what might come next. And so we welcome it. We're engaged in it. I've spoken to my Jordanian, my Egyptian, many colleagues about this plan, which we think has got real strength and is a good place to start.
But in order for the West to show good faith and real commitment to the Arab League plans, do you agree that it would be, now might be the time for us to be recognising Palestine along with a series of other nations so that we can come to the table, with good faith and join the Arab League in pushing for a rebuilding of Gaza and the development of a Palestinian state?
So, Chair, we support a Palestinian state. We want to be in a position to recognise it as the inalienable right of the Palestinian people. I read the transcript of your session with my predecessor, who described the many dilemmas, I thought, quite well about recognition, how the timing would work. As is obvious even from just our opening exchanges, this is an incredibly delicate moment. We desperately want to play our full role in getting Israel and Palestine back on the path towards a two-state solution, which clearly inevitably involves the recognition of a Palestinian state. That is the second state. And we want to play our role in that. The diplomacy and the developments in the region are incredibly sensitive, so I'm not in a position to make a further announcement this morning about the timing or the method by which we might end up recognising a Palestinian state, only that it continues to be our hope, it continues to be our commitment. We want to do so in a way where we will end up with a real functioning Palestinian state.
Well, I think you're going to be asked more questions about this. I'm just doing these as a sort of opening questions. But I just want to say that it has been our experience that any conversation that we have with any representative of Arab nations always begins with, and when are you going to represent? When are you going to recognise Palestine? It's like a kind of, do you mean this or don't you? And I just think we just need to pass that on to you, because that has been our experience. All right. Phil, you've got some questions.
Thank you, Chair. I know the government has expressed its concerns at reports that the Israeli government is preventing humanitarian aid being gotten into Gaza. With that in mind, what is the government doing to ensure that the Israeli government complies with the UK's demands to unconditionally and immediately lift restrictions on humanitarian relief into Gaza?
Thanks. So we, as I'm sure you saw, we put out a statement on the 5th of March with our partners, so the French and the Germans. I've put out a statement this morning about the restrictions of electricity into Gaza. We follow these issues incredibly closely. We have had staff on the ground. I myself have been to see the restrictions of the aid coming in from the Sinai side into Gaza. I need to be straightforward about the fact that we have been calling for this for some time. There have been moments where progress has been made. So in the early phases of the ceasefire until quite recently, there was a very notable uptick in the amount of aid going into Gaza. Is that enough? No, it is not enough. And indeed, the kind of aid that went in was still subject to restrictions, particularly around items that could be dual use. And the consequence of those restrictions is very significant on the people of Gaza, because much of what was restricted was the kind of shelter required to try and make, as the temperature has dropped, life more habitable in Gaza. So there is no neat and easy answer to this. We, as you say, have been calling repeatedly for a lifting of restrictions, which has not happened. And as I say, we've made a statement about the latest further restrictions from the Israelis. We will continue to work on this with our partners. We'll continue to talk to the Israeli government about this, and we won't stop until we see the progress that we need to see in terms of aid access.
Phil, before you go on, can I just, for the sake of people watching, and we use these terms dual use, and we all know what that means, but it may be for the public, it needs to be explained why the Israelis would be restricting certain goods going in, because they say it's for dual use. I wonder, sorry to interrupt, but I wonder if you might explain that, and perhaps give us some of the more extreme examples of when things have been refused because they are said to be used for dual use.
Forgive me, Chair, and please do correct me if I'm
sorry to interrupt.
Becoming too jargony. So dual use is a term that tends to mean items that could be used both for military and civilian purposes. And in this context, that is being used, for example, to restrict tents going in, because the claim is that the poles could be used as weaponry. There's been restrictions of sleeping bags because they're said to be in camouflage colours. There's been restrictions on water purification units because there's some fear that they could be used for some other purpose. The nature of the dual-use restrictions that Israel has imposed have been so far-reaching as to make again, some other jargon, I'm afraid, what the aid community would call winterization, i.e. providing the aid required to help people respond to the colder conditions of winter, very, very difficult indeed. And it was a question that was very much on our minds as winter came in Gaza, and it was an issue on which we made limited progress, I'm afraid, with the Israeli government.
Thank you. Rifle.
Thank you, Chair. Minister, are you able to confirm that it has been impressed upon the Israeli government that they have an obligation under international humanitarian law to allow the free and unimpeded access of aid to Gaza?
I can, yeah.
Thank you.
Richard.
Thank you, Chair. Last September, the Foreign Secretary assessed that overall Israel is not committed to compliance with international humanitarian law in Gaza. And that led to the partial suspension of arms exports. But why did it not lead to a full suspension of arms exports?
So I think it's really important when we talk about the arms to first start with context, which is this is a small amount of arms compared to the overall arms that the IDF has. And then let's talk specifically about what has been suspended and what has not. The assessment that we made was that there was a serious risk of breaches of IHL. And so we made restrictions with one caveat, which I will come to. The restrictions we made were for the use of, for the permission to sell weapons which could be used offensively in the conduct of hostilities, which could pose a risk of a breach of IHL. So what are the things that are not included? It includes the things which aren't for the use in hostilities. So there are dual-use items, like, for example, food processing chemicals, which we satisfied ourselves were not for use in these purposes. There were things like components for air defences, which were clearly not being used in relation to the activities in Gaza. So I've seen some commentary about the numbers. There is quite a large number of things where a licence is still in issue, which would be easy to draw the conclusion that means we're still selling arms. Lots and lots of this stuff is dual-use stuff where we have to satisfy ourselves that it's not arms. There has to be a licence because they could be used in other contexts, but that in this context we're confident.
Perhaps then we could talk about the F-35 specifically.
Yeah, which I was coming to. So we did make a specific carve-out for F-35s because to do so was in the interest of international peace and security. The F-35 programme is a very complex, multi-nation fighter jet, as you know. We provide components to it. We provide components under an agreement to a global spares pool. We could not, where those components are being sold directly to Israel, those licenses were suspended. Where those components are being supplied to the global pool, we could not suspend those licenses without imperiling the overall F-35 supply chain, which, as I'm sure members of this committee in particular would understand, would have significant far-reaching ramifications given the role of F-35s right across our allies and indeed in our own region of Europe.
So, Minister, you talk about introducing this test of international peace and security, this so-called balancing test. How is that consistent with the UN Arms Trade Treaty?
I hope you'll understand, which I won't point to the exact part of the treaties, but there is provision for international peace and security, and that's, this has been looked at in great detail, as you'd expect, by legal advisors right across government, and we were satisfied that that was consistent with our international legal commitments.
I just ask you though, Holland produces some spare parts for the F-35s as well, don't they? And there's recently been a challenge in the courts saying that they shouldn't be supplying those parts for F-35s because the F-35s could be used in Israel. And given that the way that the Israelis were using F-35s, it could in turn be used for breaches of international humanitarian law. And so the courts in Holland have said that actually they can stop selling those parts or label them as not for use in Israel. And that has been the Dutch position. So if it's the Dutch position, why can't it be the British position?
As in Holland, this is going to be tested by judicial review in the Al Haq case, so I imagine that some of these arguments will be tested by courts, but it's the position of the British government.
You're waiting to the courts in May, and then we'll find out.
No, to be clear, Chair, we're confident in our position, but there is going to be, like in Holland, there will be a court case here and they'll come to a finding.
We've just heard about the government position, the statement that you put out this morning, Minister, around breaches of international humanitarian law. If this is a balancing exercise between IHL on the one hand and the serious prejudice to international peace and security on the other, then what thought has been given actually to the fact that when we see an acceleration in breaches of international humanitarian law, that we might then up the pressure on arms exports through this carve-out for the F-35?
So I wouldn't describe the balancing test as being one which balances IHL against international peace and security. IHL provides for, in applying the law, allows for decision makers to consider the balance between international peace and security and some of the other provisions of international humanitarian law. So I wouldn't want to quite accept your framing that it's IHL on one side and international peace and security in the other. IHL considers questions of international peace and security. If the question is, will we, in the face of further concerns, take actions on the F-35, I would just restate our position. We believe the continued operation of the F-35 programme is critical to international peace and security for a whole range of our neighbours, and our position is, as I've set it out repeatedly in Parliament.
It seems to me that the government hasn't denied that the position on the F-35 carve-out is in breach of international humanitarian law. But rather...
Can I just stop you there? No, we haven't. We're saying it's consistent with international humanitarian law, and it will be tested in a judicial review.
Well, I mean, in correspondence that I've seen between Minister Doughty and the chair of the Business and Trade Committee, it seems to me that the UK is potentially willing to admit that there are violations of the Geneva Conventions, but that's outweighed by the fact that the F-35 is supplied to a partnership of 20 nations, and that there are other uses of the F-35 in the world that mean that international peace and security could be prejudiced by any withholding of components of the F-35. It seems to me that actually there is a recognition that we can't be fully compliant with international humanitarian law, but there is an offset here. Wouldn't you agree?
No, I wouldn't. I think for the reasons of my previous answer, which is if international humanitarian law provides in its provisions for a balancing act, which is quite common in both international and domestic law, then it's not fair to say, and the government wouldn't accept, that the continued sale of F-35s is sort of in contravention of international humanitarian law or somewhat in some way out with. And I don't think Minister Doughty's response to the Trade Committee indicated that.
One last question on this. In recent days, it feels like there has been an escalation in breaches of international humanitarian law from Israel, for example, with the withholding of electricity. Would the government consider keeping in play the parts that we export for the F-35 that we have no means of tracking, which might go to our allies and then subsequently go to Israel for use potentially in Gaza should the war flare up again?
So I want to be clear, there are two particular elements of recent announcements that have caused us concern. One is about the entry of humanitarian aid into Gaza, where we have been very clear with our partners on how serious an issue this is. And I've been clear this morning that in order to be compliant with international humanitarian law, it is very important that energy is provided into Gaza for desalination and many other purposes that are essential for supporting life in Gaza. Those are very important issues to us. I've set out a position on the F-35s, and I don't anticipate that will change, but it will indeed be tested in a judicial review, I'm sure, in due course.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you. If I could just come in on this question and bring a slightly different perspective in relation to arms exports and Iran. I welcome, obviously, the government's condemning of Iranian malign activity in the region. But in relation to export ban of arms to Israel, and of course, in my view, the Prime Minister was right to utilise our assets in the region, particularly the RAF and Royal Navy, in response to the recent drone and missile attacks from Iran. But on the other hand, by banning exports, we've limited Israel's options to defend itself. And I just wondered whether you could kind of set out how, if you can see how perhaps these policies may to some appear not to be fully aligned, and therefore maybe it'd be helpful if you could share what you see as the kind of long-term strategy for exports to Israel, not necessarily what's happening immediately right now, but kind of looking forwards.
Yeah. So I should say, Afra, that it's a matter of regret that we have suspensions of arms to Israel. We would like to be in a position where we were not in that place, where we could satisfy ourselves that there wasn't a serious risk of breaches of international humanitarian law, and our deep partnership with Israel could continue on that basis across a whole range of fields. We will, as you say, we did mobilise assets to defend Israel consistent with its completely legitimate right to self-defence under international humanitarian law. We deplore Iranian attacks on Israel and the malign influence that they have in the region. These two things obviously are in some tension. We both wish to act in defence of Israel against Iran, but we also want to ensure that all of our partners, friends and allies take a rigorous approach to international humanitarian law. That is an important principle for us. And perhaps with your friends you can be most critical, and so we are clear with Israel about where we differ from them. And on this question we have been clear, as I've been clear this morning, as the Foreign Secretary along with his counterparts has been clear last week. That doesn't mean that we have in any way become misty-eyed about what is happening in the Middle East. We are clear on the threat that Iran poses to Israel, to Syria, to Lebanon, to a whole range of regional partners, and indeed the threat that they pose here. And the Security Minister laid out some pretty important measures last week on steps we're taking to ensure that they don't pose a threat here as well.
Right. Alex.
Thank you, Minister. What has the UK's response been to the International Court of Justice ruling in July that the Israeli settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories were illegal?
On the advisory opinion itself, as I'm sure the committee knows, we're still considering it. It's quite a far-reaching opinion with some novel elements, and we want to treat it with the rigour and the seriousness that it deserves. But on the substantive point you make, we agree that settlements are illegal. That has been our long-standing position, and we want to see them ended. We want to see a move back towards a two-state solution. We think that the fastest way to get the Israelis to leave occupied Palestinian territory is through negotiations where the Israelis can have confidence in their security, and the Palestinians too can have confidence that they're going to have the stability and security that they require. So on some of the fundamental policy questions of the advisory opinion, we are in total accord. It's consistent with long-standing British policy. On the detail of the advisory opinion from a legal perspective, it will take us a little bit more time, I'm afraid.
Thank you. And we were in the West Bank a couple of weeks ago, and we saw, I mean, as many others have reported, some of the extremist actions by Israeli settlers against Palestinians in Area C. Schools were being burned, mosques were attacked, livestock was being stolen. It's a particularly awful situation. It feels like the UK's response of just providing advice to businesses not to trade in those settlements is not enough in that context, particularly when we have such a strong response to the ICG's ruling on the Chagos Islands. It feels like our response in this case has been much weaker. Are we going further enough? And is it appropriate for us to be negotiating a new trade agreement with Israel under the current situation?
Yeah. So let me say, since this is the first time that settler violence has come up, that the government tracks this closely. We recognise both the increase in settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories and the very worrying increase in violence in relation to settlements, and we condemn that completely, and we've put in place sanctions in October to reflect the strength of our feeling on these questions. In relation to trade with settlements, we are very clear about our position in relation to settlements. We update that guidance to British businesses routinely. We're not an outlier in this. This is the same approach that the European Union takes as well. But we advise British businesses in pretty strong terms to bear in mind our view on the illegality of settlements under international law when considering their investments and activities in the region. That is quite a strong statement from the British government. Were I a British business, I would not be conducting settlement trade.
Why wouldn't you just ignore it?
Because I would think, Chair, that the British government warning me about matters of international law would be quite a serious risk to my business. And given the clarity of both the British and the European position on the labelling of goods, then you would want to, I think, as a British business, assure yourself that you were confident what was from within the green line and what was
What would
without.
happen to you if you were to invest in the West Bank? What would happen to you?
Well, I think if you were found to be inaccurately labelling goods which were traded into the UK or the EU, then there would be consequences.
Would there?
There would be. Yeah.
What consequences have there been?
This is so the question, Chair, I think is: have there been cases where people are found to be inaccurately labelling their goods, which were in fact from occupied Palestinian territories rather than from within Green Line Israel? I'd have to come back to you with what the precise legal consequences are for businesses who inaccurately label their places of origin for their goods, because that's a DBT responsibility rather than an FCDO one.
Just label them as Israeli. That's what they do.
So we are aware, that's why we update our guidance so regularly, we are aware of the challenges of ensuring that goods are properly and accurately labelled. The Co-op has done some work on this, for example, to try and ensure that all of their goods, they are confident in them, but we are clear in our position. I recognise the difficulties in enforcement, but we are clear.
Frankly, if the Co-op didn't do it, then nobody would be doing it at all, and good for the Co-op. But, we're talking about a whole range of British businesses, and to be honest, if we just got advice from the Foreign Office saying that they should think twice, what does it mean?
Were I a British business, I would take it seriously.
And is it appropriate, with all of the breaches of international humanitarian law, the ICG rulings, the other challenges with Israel we're going to hear about later in the committee, for us to be pursuing a trade deal with Israel? The government has just announced a trade envoy to undertake that. Are we not going too far?
So we're reviewing a number of our trade agreements and negotiations across the world, and the Secretary of State for DBT will be setting out a little bit more about where we intend to prioritise in due course.
Right? Uma.
Thank you, Chair. The government has condemned some comments by the Israeli government and ministers on proposing the annexation of the West Bank. We were there not long ago. I would argue the annexation has already begun. But I'd like to know what actions the government would take if there was an attempt to annex the West Bank.
So, and I want to be clear on the general questions about the occupied Palestinian territories. I really would want to just re-emphasise our concern about the expansion of settlements and the expansion of violence. Just take a step back on the question of annexation. We're absolutely clear. We do not want to see annexation. We would consider it illegal under international law. And I imagine the committee will understand that I'm not going to speculate about what would happen in a hypothetical situation. But
you have a plan. Is there a plan? It's not like we don't know that the Israelis aren't thinking of doing this. Does the international community have a plan if the Israelis go and annex the West Bank? What's going to happen? That's the question he was asking.
Minister, you don't need to disclose what the government would do, but are there actions in place? Will there be consequences if this happens?
I think there are two main scenarios about what's going to happen next. One scenario, which I very, very much hope that we see, is that we're able to try and return towards something that looks like a path towards a two-state solution, something that involves the long-sought normalisation of relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia, where the Saudis, and I'm sure you heard from them during your visit, are clear on what they would need in order to be on that path. And I hope that we are in a position where the Abraham Accords started under the last Trump administration are in a position of being completed. And the incredibly difficult politics on all sides of this are seriously engaged with, and progress is made towards a two-state solution. It's the only answer. I can only imagine how distant that feels to the committee, having recently visited the region. But the reason we repeat it with such emphasis is it is truly the only option. The alternatives, including annexation, are disastrous. They are a breach of international law. If they were to come about, we would of course have more to say, given the magnitude of what that would involve for Israel, for Palestine, and for the region. But it is not a scenario that we want to entertain because it is so clearly not what the region requires if we are to get to that happier scenario that I truly hope that we see, which is a two-state solution, normalisation with Saudi Arabia and a more becalmed region.
And are we, Minister, are we making that clear in our negotiations and our discussions with counterparts, because I've got here some of my notes from our meeting, and a member of the Foreign Affairs and Defence Committee from the Knesset has said to us that the solution of a two-state is a bit far. They're openly saying that.
Yes, so firstly, in response to the first part of your question, yes, we are making it clear. And I recognise that across Israeli politics, there is a whole range of views about where we get to. I think there are those in Israel who understand that in order to live in harmony with their region, to complete the Abraham Accords, then a two-state solution will be necessary.
Thank you. Just turning to settler violence.
Sorry, before we move on, I'm sorry. Can I just ask again, because I appreciate that you say that that you will have more to say if there is annexation, that you have clear views about it, but I mean, what we got, I think, from please, if anybody else disagrees with me, do say. But I think the clear impression we got from our visit was that the Israelis don't really care that much about what the international community thinks or says. We want to know what they're going to do about it. And we certainly met many more people who were interested in annexation of the West Bank than we did, who were interested in a two-state solution in amongst the leadership, amongst the politicians. So given that's the situation, can I just ask my question again? What's the plan? What's plan B? What are we actually going to do if they annex? Because we could just be sitting here and it could just happen.
I mean, I recognise, Chair, we all see the reports from debates in the Knesset from Israeli politicians. So I'm pleased to confirm to the committee the strength of our views on these questions, but I'm afraid I won't be drawn to speculate into what we might do.
You can assure us that you'll do something.
I can assure you we'll do something.
Okay.
Just a quick follow-up on a point you made earlier when you referenced the importance of the Abraham Accords, and just wondered whether you are taking any steps to push for UK leadership on the Abraham Accords. And, for example, might you consider having a special envoy for the Abraham Accords from the UK?
So we do try and show leadership on a range of issues. So we joined, and I'm sorry for the acronyms again, Chair. We joined CCPA, which is was previously a bilateral agreement for security and investment partnership between the US and Bahrain. We joined it in December, I think, and that was part of our efforts. It came about in the aftermath of the Abraham Accords. We joined it in part out of our commitment to try and, partly our commitment to Bahrain, our commitment to the Middle East, but in part because we do want to see the very positive trend that the Abraham Accords represent, which is towards a region in harmony with each other. That progress has clearly been arrested very significantly by the violence in the Middle East over the last period. We will continue to work with the Saudis, with others, because we do want an Israel at peace with its region, and we'll do everything we can to try and support that.
I guess my question was really around whether we're doing anything to show kind of leadership rather than obviously supporting international efforts that are happening. Do you have kind of thoughts on how the UK can actually show that we are, at the forefront of trying to find a solution, a long-term solution?
Yeah, and so I think what will it take to make further progress on the Abraham Accords? I mean, I think we have rehearsed already some of the questions that are at issue, and we would like to play our full role in trying to bridge some of the differences that exist between those who are not yet signatory to the Abraham Accords and the Israelis. And clearly there are a whole range of issues which are deeply, deeply emotive, and on which you have clearly heard recently very strong views, I'm sure, from both the Saudis and the Israelis and many others in the region about what it would take. And I want to be clear, we are not happy with the status quo. We want to move forward. There is incredibly difficult politics and policy in the midst of that, which I wouldn't want to give the committee the impression that I think completing the Abraham Accords soon will be easy, but it is one of the things which is right at the very centre of some of our diplomacy in the region.
Thank you, Chair. I went into the occupied Palestinian territories a few weeks ago, into Area C. I met with the Bedouin women, and some of the stories that they told me and the images I've seen from their phones and the videos of the violence they're facing, in particular as women and their children, young girls, is shocking and it's harrowing, and I don't wish to repeat it here. But I want to know what steps the government are taking to prevent the indiscriminate violence that and attacks on civilians that many people in the West Bank are facing. Alex mentioned earlier, we saw a mosque that had been burnt out. Some of this is being state-sanctioned. The IDF are standing outside. The police will stand outside. The settlers go in and do what they want and come outside. What steps are we taking as a government to call this out?
And let me start by saying I'm clearly not familiar with the details of what you were told, but I too hear truly awful stories of violence in the West Bank, and there has been a very concerning trend in the West Bank. It is, and I saw, Chair, that last night in the media you were highlighting both the importance, rightly, of events in Gaza and the West Bank. Stability in the West Bank is vitally important too, and we are concerned by some of the developments there, and we are particularly concerned by the violence against civilians that you describe. As I say, we have been tracking this very closely. We have seen a marked uptick in violence associated with settlements on the civilian population of the West Bank and elsewhere. And we, as I say, we have taken sanctions measures already, and we keep them under very close review. You mentioned earlier, Uma, some of the comments of the Israeli government ministers, one of whom has left and one of whom remains. It is very unusual for one government to comment on the comments of ministers of another, but we took that rather unusual step because we were so concerned by some of the violence in the West Bank, which clearly has political support from some elements, which we would like to see stopped.
Some of this has been described as an unlawful use of force by the UN Human Rights Office. People want to see us hold perpetrators to account in line with their obligations under international law. They want to see Britain leading from the front. We've had a long history of standing up for human rights around the world. What will we be doing?
So on settlers in particular, there are questions in our mind about what role we can play to try and practically reduce the violence. The sanctions in October were far-reaching and aimed both at the perpetrators of violence, but also those who provide the infrastructure required for the construction of settlements themselves. We keep these issues under close review. I won't comment about what we might do next, but sanctions on settlers, both the physical construction and violence, remain very much at issue within the Foreign Office.
Can I just say, when we've discussed this, we were all very encouraged by that, and we would give you all, we don't want to just criticise the Foreign Office today. We think that the sanctions that you've taken out against those that are responsible for facilitating the building of settlements and the violent settlers is absolutely the right thing to do. Our only criticism is there isn't enough of it.
Thank you.
I'll leave it there.
Sorry. John.
Thank you. Minister, you've been very clear that, in your view and the British government's view, a two-state solution remains the only viable.
I'm so sorry. Absam very sweetly is smiling at me. Why have you not come to me? You knew I had some other questions. I'm so sorry. May I go back to Absam?
In relation to annexation, just to keep the topic only one. So you mentioned that you don't want to talk about hypothetical situations and it'd be speculating about things potentially happening. If we are going through, if Palestinians now are going through annexation, it's currently happening, what specific action will be taken now to prevent annexation from taking place? Because I hear your comment about the action will be taken at the end if annexation is, it goes through, but will it not be too late at that point? Like, what are we doing now to prevent it from becoming complete annexation?
So I think there's and jump in if I'm mischaracterising your question, but I guess there is I took some of the questions about annexation to be about formal legal annexation of occupied Palestinian territories. That is not to say that we are not focused on the elements of practical annexation. You cannot get aid into Gaza without the agreement of the Israelis. That is clearly very significant de facto control. You have seen yourselves in the West Bank the degree of control that is exerted there as well. We want to see in both Gaza and the West Bank a situation where normal Palestinian life can return. We do not want to see forcible displacement. We do not want to see an expansion of settlements and settler violence. All of these things, I mean, the account Uma gives, and indeed Alex, of elements of day-to-day life in the West Bank being impeded by Israeli measures are clearly a degree of de facto annexation of some of the areas, even if they are not legal. And we, on all of these issues in the way that I describe, we are clear with our Israeli partners that we do want to see a reduction in tensions in the West Bank. We want to see in both Gaza and the West Bank freedom for Palestinians to go about their lives.
Minister, if I may, what specific action are we taking to actually prevent the expansion of settlements?
So beyond the sanction measures and the pretty strong diplomatic language that we've used about it, we've worked with partners, we've made joint statements, we have sought at each and every stage to create the conditions where settlements are not happening, and I recognise that we are in the midst of an expansion of those settlements, so we will continue to work on it.
Israel continues to ignore our condemnations and continues to do as it pleases and continues to either cross an uncrossable line or new precedents that they seem to jump over. Will there be a red line for us where we say, that's it, enough is enough? This will now result in the lack of viability of a potential two-state solution. When is that red line going to be for us?
Honestly, Absam, the problem with ever saying that the two-state solution is not viable is the alternatives are definitely and considerably worse. So I recognise that the viability of a two-state solution requires a whole range of very difficult practical policy problems which settlements make worse, and settlements clearly undermine the physical viability of a two-state solution. Does that make me think that the UK government and our partners should pivot towards talking about a one-state solution? No, I don't. I don't think it would work. I think it would be worse. I think, as painful as it is, we need to hold open always the gateway back to a two-state solution, because ultimately that is what will secure security and stability for both Israelis and Palestinians. So I recognise how difficult it is in this moment where settlements are expanding not to give up hope in a two-state solution, but we have to. If voices like Britain do not continue pushing for a two-state solution, then I fear it will be extinguished as a hope.
So you referenced earlier trade, and in response to the Chair's questions, you said businesses are expected to bear in mind the illegality of trade that comes from settlements. Why would we not consider banning the imports of settlement goods? Would that not prevent settlements from thriving?
Well, so I'm going to set out the position legally as it is both in the UK and the EU. We are really clear.
That's merely advice. It's not sort of they're not required to follow. Well, there's no sort of
there is a different legal
advice.
status for goods from within the Green Line and outside the Green Line, and that's why I say to the Chair that if you breach the labelling, so that you try to pretend in either the UK or the EU that your goods are from inside the Green Line when they're from outside, then there are consequences, because there are different legal structures under the. We and the Europeans have preferential access for Israeli goods from within the Green Line, but that does not extend to settlement goods, so there is a legal difference.
Why not?
The Israelis refuse to change the labelling. I mean, the Israelis don't distinguish. So so I have always personally gone out of my way to support Israel and will buy Israeli goods, but I will also go completely out of my way to ensure that I don't buy settler goods. But I realise that sometimes I just don't know because they're just labelled as Israeli. And that's the problem, isn't it? And we don't seem to be able to do anything about it.
So, as I said in the earlier exchange, we are conscious of this issue. We keep the advice very regularly updated. There is a clearly an issue, which is the labelling of Israeli goods is an issue which is the whole system of international trade does rely on accurate labelling at the point of origin, and if it were not to be accurately labelled, then that does undermine the whole system, and that is very, very difficult, and difficult from outside to enforce proper labelling from within the Green Line and without it. So I recognise the dilemma that you describe. We do everything we can to try and ensure that the goods that come from Israel are properly labelled, but I recognise the issues that you describe.
Mr. Hickey, are you trying to come in at this point, or?
If I might just add on the question of tackling the growth in settlements, in addition to all of the bilateral measures that the Minister has set out, I think it's also very important the role the UK plays with our European allies and the United States as well in pushing back against the growth in settlements. I know this is on the agenda for the EU's Association Council with Israel 2 weeks ago. And for the United States, we know, as the Minister said, that the United States is keen to progress the Abraham Accords and secure normalisation between Israel and Saudi Arabia. But it will be, I think, very challenging, very difficult for that to happen unless there is a Palestinian state in place. And so unless we as the international community can work with our partners to prevent the further growth in settlements and preserve the opportunity for a Palestinian state, it will be very difficult to achieve that wider aim of normalisation between the United States and Saudi Arabia. So we are prioritising this in our conversations with the new US administration and also with our European partners. And I think it's working together with the US and European partners that we can have additional impact on this question, but also on other barriers to a two-state solution as well, which no doubt we will come on to.
I mean, didn't President Trump say a month ago that next month, i.e. now, he was going to tell us what his view was on the annexation of the West Bank?
He did hint that there would be further announcements to come, although I would note that at the end of President Trump's first term, his administration did make a proposal for a Palestinian state. It was not a proposal that was taken up by either side at the time, but the last time that President Trump looked at this, his proposal was for a two-state solution.
Before we move off the West Bank, I think Uma's got an important issue that I think I'd like to kind of just for her to cover about the 40,000 people who've been displaced.
Thank you, Chair. The Israeli Defence Minister stated in February that Israel will not allow the return of at least 40,000 forcibly displaced Palestinians to their homes in the West Bank. What's the UK doing to prevent this forced displacement and escalation of violence in line with our obligations under international humanitarian law?
So we've been clear that we do not support forcible displacement. The whole thrust of the Arab plan that was announced following their conference and that we welcomed last week was that there should be no forcible displacement of Palestinians and that there should be a programme for reconstruction that allows Gazans to stay in their homes if they wish. Clearly there will be some Gazans who do wish to leave. The rubble in Gaza is testament to the degree of destruction that has happened there, and people will make their own choices about where they want to be. But we do not want to see forcible displacement, and I think we all heard the Prime Minister talking movingly about the images of people walking back to their homes despite them being rubble. And we are clear that we will support them to do that, and the Arab plan is a very important component in that.
So I think Uma's question was about Jenin, the 40,000 that have been displaced from the refugee camp in the north of the West Bank.
Oh, right, yeah. So we've been watching events carefully in Jenin. We don't want to see forcible displacement in any part of the occupied Palestinian territories or indeed anywhere. And we saw those reports about the 40,000. We are, as I said earlier in relation to my comments about the West Bank, it is vital that we see stability in the West Bank, in Jenin and across the whole territory, just as it is that we see it in Gaza.
Right. Finally, it's John.
Thank you. Minister, you have been admirably clear about the position of the government in seeing a two-state solution as the only possible way forward. That has been pretty much the evidence this committee received prior to our visit to Israel, and it represents the views of the Arab nations. I think it's fair to say that when we spoke to Israeli politicians from all parties, that it seems further away than ever before. And the reason is the utter trauma that Israel still suffers as a result of the 7th of October and the determination that it can never happen again. And they said to us very clearly that they would never accept the idea of living next door to a state controlled by people who wanted to destroy them. So part of the challenge is to persuade Israel to resume working towards that solution, but it will require very clear assurances about their security. What can we do to try and win support in Israel by giving them that kind of reassurance?
Yeah. Mr. John, I've been both a pure diplomat and now a politician, and I visited Israel in December, relatively shortly after the October the 7th attacks, and that palpable sense of trauma, which I know you felt even now, was so visceral, and even from the Israelis who had spent the longest time working on outreach on pro-Palestinian activities, what would sometimes be described as the peaceniks of the kibbutzes. That trauma was clearly found right across Israeli society, as of course it is also in Palestinian society. I mean, we've all heard these incredibly evocative accounts of just the trauma that has been visited on so many Palestinian civilians, as there has been, as you would expect. I see families of the hostages on a regular basis, and you can hardly get your mind around the awfulness of the situation they live in day and day out. And I recognise, as a politician, I mean, you can only imagine, we all have constituents who come to us in states of distress, and I'm sure that we all feel that distress very earnestly. One can only imagine what it is like to be an Israeli politician or a Palestinian politician in these moments. And it is incredibly hard. I want to make no bones about it. It's incredibly hard for either side to see the route through towards a two-state solution, given that requires, exactly as you say, a shared commitment to each other's security. And that's a shared commitment that's so hard to imagine with the politics that exists in Israel as it does today, with the politics that exists in the occupied Palestinian territories as it does today. In a previous life, I was a negotiator with the Taliban on a peace process. And I spent some time in Northern Ireland talking to some of the communities there about how they made their steps forward towards a peace process, and the horrifically difficult politics within communities about agreeing to trust the other side. And I make no bones about how difficult this is. For there to be trust between the two sides in these conditions is incredibly difficult. But that does not mean, in the way that I said to Absam, that does not mean that there is any other option. Ultimately, it is going to be politics at its very core on both sides. And I can only imagine what you heard during your trips, and I imagine you heard a lot of intemperate views about the impossibilities of taking any steps, of having any trust with either side. But ultimately, for all the reasons I've said, that is the only way. I think it is the only way that we are going to see a calmer region and two states living safely side by side.
So what do you hope that we can achieve at the conference coming up in June in terms of trying to begin to give that reassurance?
So I think, the June conference is important, but I think that my own experience, politics doesn't tend to revolve around international conferences. There's much of this which is about trying to find, my hope, Sir John, is that we're able to build up from the Arab proposals towards an answer for what is going to happen next in Gaza that provides safety, security and stability for the Gazan people, that provides for the release of all hostages, that gives Israel confidence that what happens next in Gaza will not be a return to Hamas plans for tunnels and violence and rape and murder, but that there is a plan there that they can have confidence and that they can relax the restrictions with confidence in the West Bank, and that we can move towards a single state for Palestine which joins Gaza and the West Bank, and a two-state solution with negotiations. Now, I recognise that as I go on in that sequence, it gets harder and harder, but that is what we've got to try and build confidence towards. That's what all of our diplomacy with both the Israelis the Palestinians and the region is pushing heavily towards. It is difficult, but we cannot stop.
And we talk to them about the possibility of one day achieving a two-state solution. They spoke of it being generations away, and the recommendation that they made was education. And the reason I think they said education was because they simply do not believe that the current generation of people running the Palestinian Authority, as well as Hamas, are willing to accept a peaceful solution. So they want to see, literally, the children of children brought up without being radicalized. Now, firstly, can we do more to support that, and how do you see reform of the Palestinian Authority as being a part of this?
Yeah, I mean, I'll come to those points both about education and the Palestinian Authority, but just on the point about generations, and I hope you won't mind me saying this story, but so in 2014 I was in the Foreign Office, and I was sent briefly as part of a rapid deployment team to Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories as part of the crisis then. And I remember seeing a friend who'd gone to university with me, who'd done Aliyah and was now an Israeli citizen and a rabbi there, and I asked him about what the route out at the time. As you probably recall, there had been terrible violence on both sides. The people in Gaza were suffering then as they suffer now. And he gave me a similar answer then, which is, it's not possible now. There aren't partners for peace. We have to hope and wait and that it will change. This is so much worse than what I saw in 2014. The trend has not been a positive one. The hope that the next generation will be able to address the fractured politics of this one is, I think, said more in hope than expectation. And so I think we have, it may be true that this is incredibly distant, but we cannot accept that. We do need to work with urgency and determination, and that's why I'm being so stubborn about the two-state solution, is that I truly couldn't bear it to go back 11 years from now and find the situation no better, in the same way that I have come back to the patch after a long time away to find the violence yet worse than it was. On the questions of education and PA reform, so there are some very important provisions in the Colonna report. Chair, I recognise that's jargon. So the Colonna report, conducted by the former well-respected French Foreign Minister into the operations of UNRWA, looked in particular at some of the questions of the content of the textbooks provided both by UNRWA and others in Gaza, and I myself have met with those who are concerned by what is in those textbooks. And there was provisions in the Colonna report which we fully support to try and make sure that the textbooks in Gaza and across the occupied Palestinian territories are teaching a curriculum that can help enable peace rather than enable hate. And that is incredibly important. We are also clear that there does need to be reform of the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority plays a very important role, but there is changes that do need to be made in order to give Palestinians, first of all, as well as the rest of us, the confidence that the PA is able to discharge its functions in an effective way, that it can be a good partner for peace. There have been some welcome reforms that they have made. Recently, we've provided £5 million for their reform journey. We work closely with them. I talked to the Prime Minister Mustafa and other Palestinian counterparts. Sir Michael Barber continues his role in supporting their reform, and this is an important question for us on which we will remain focused.
And the support we are giving will not be affected by the reduction in overseas aid?
So the Prime Minister has been clear that Gaza is one of the areas which will get particular protection from the cuts, but I'm not in a position yet to spell out the full implication of the reduction in ODA on the Middle East.
Alfred, did you have some questions that you want to ask?
I think Sir John's asked most of them. I just wanted to, just a very quick question, just to be clear. Do you agree, Minister, that Hamas must play no part in the future governance or administration of Gaza?
I do. Hamas have committed the most astonishing acts of brutality. And returning to Sir John's question about trust and confidence and two sides working together, how could any Israeli politician have any confidence that an administration controlled by Hamas could be a real partner for the Israelis.
Just as a follow-up to that, obviously at the beginning of last year, we had initially paused funding towards UNRWA because of information that suggested that UNRWA officials had been involved in October the 7th attacks. Obviously then, in the middle of last year, that was changed. There are still some of our allies who don't, who are continuing to pause aid to UNRWA. Just wondered what conversations you'd had with UNRWA officials or your counterparts which assure you that there's confidence in the organisation.
So as I say, we've engaged closely with the Kelowna Review and its recommendations, and we're putting our money where our mouth is. We are supporting the changes that UNRWA needs to make through the Kelowna process with funding. I've had conversations with Commissioner General and others in UNRWA, as have my ministerial colleagues. We remain closely focused on these issues. I'd just like to address, given you've given me the opportunity, some of the recent allegations about UNRWA, in particular the comments of Emily Demaria upon her release, where she said that she believes she'd been held in an UNRWA hospital. Now, we have obviously talked to UNRWA about those very serious and concerning claims. UNRWA make the reasonable point that many UNRWA hospitals at various points have not been in the control of UNRWA. There have been points where they have been they've been forcibly evacuated, or their operation has not been possible. But these are clearly very serious concerns to have been raised, particularly by a British national who was held clearly by Hamas for an incredibly long time. So we welcome UNRWA's commitments to do an independent review into those claims, which we will update the House on once we've got the findings.
Minister, you mentioned earlier on your previous professional background, and obviously you've quite deep experience in issues around hostages and trying to secure their release. I wonder what lessons the British government have drawn from the experience of dealing with attempts to release the hostages over the last 18 months, both in the, obviously there was a period of intense violence, but also since then, and how does that inform the government's approach to hostages going forward?
This has been just the most astonishingly difficult period for the hostage families, as I think we all know. I know many in this room will have met them. And when I compare my own experience on hostage negotiations to this period, my heart so goes out to those families. I worked on a whole series of British nationals who'd been detained by the Taliban. The efforts to secure their release largely happened in private rather than broadcast in public in the way that they have. They didn't all come out at exactly the same time, but there wasn't this terrible weight. I mean, one feels the deepest empathy for those who still have their relatives, their loved ones, probably underground somewhere in Gaza, where many of them do not know whether they're alive or dead, after we have seen many releases, many incredibly welcome releases. But what it must feel like for those, including Avi Natan's mother, who I met last week, what it must feel like for them to be in these circumstances is just sort of beyond bearing. And I, given this experience and my previous experience, I'm so conscious, Blair, that these hostage cases are so distinct, that all of them are so different from each other. The pain and the agony for the families is sort of almost unique to their particular circumstances, whether they've come out early, come out late, whether there's been a military rescue, whether they've been killed in a military rescue. And it does really redouble my commitment to ensure that in the various changes that we have proposed to the Foreign Office, so in relation to these kinds of questions, most particularly in relation to an envoy, that we try and make sure that we provide those families and those loved ones who go through the most extreme pain you can imagine each and every day, the most effective possible support. And I would like to pay tribute to those in the Foreign Office who have worked night and day, both on the questions of how people might be released, but also to try and support the British-linked families. I was pleased to be able to thank them. Many of them were former colleagues of mine, in fact, sat not far from seats I used to sit in, and I know how consumed they too would have been, and they will never be in front of you, but they have my absolute thanks, and they are very dedicated public servants who are doing their best. That is not to say that families haven't had reasonable criticisms of the way in which they've been supported at different times, and we will, of course, be looking at them.
You mentioned a moment ago that a lot of the work in hostage situations takes place very kind of privately, but behind the scenes. And you mentioned the Foreign Secretary's commitment to appointing a special envoy for this. I'm wondering what would a special envoy bring to the table that the sort of professional, sort of behind the scenes, quiet diplomacy and patient negotiation doesn't bring to the table. Because I guess as you're thinking about appointing this envoy, there may be two models. There's someone who has a sort of big personality and a status and brings something to the table there, or there is a model where it's maybe someone with a more quiet diplomatic professional negotiating background. And I'm sort of wondering what does the experience of the last 18 months sort of push you towards in terms of the value of an envoy?
I think there are three elements to these cases, each of which is quite distinct. One is if negotiations are possible, and often they're not, and we won't make substantive concessions to those who take our nationals hostage. So there is, as I know painfully well, there is a limit to how far you can negotiate in order to secure release, given that long-standing and I think right policy position that we have always taken. So there's one element which is to be the negotiator, and to be the negotiator, there's often two different views about who is the best kind of negotiator. Often it will be, as you say, a professional diplomat deeply steeped in the region, hopefully steeped in the relationships with those involved. Often, for example, a ambassador, a deputy ambassador, a first secretary will be the person who knows. I'm not talking about Israel-Palestine here, I'm talking about the issue in general. Often it will be an experienced diplomat in the country who will best know the players and is best able to effect, hopefully, a quick and quiet resolution to a problem. In other cases, and these are the cases which we've been particularly focused on, some of the Iran cases are very obvious, and my own experience with the Taliban is similar to this. You have cases where quick and quiet is not an option, and you end up in a longer and more drawn-out situation. And in some of those situations, private negotiations are possible, and in some of them they're not, because your counterpart wants to broadcast absolutely everything that you do, usually for leverage purposes. I mean, we've got to be clear that often when people take British nationals, they're doing it for political effect here, and they want the House of Commons to be pressing ministers to make concessions or do more. And that's an awful situation for everybody to be. So as we think about the envoy, we think there's a negotiation role where we need to be clear whether or not we want them to do negotiations or not. And in lots of cases, and I would suspect the vast majority of cases, I would prefer a negotiator who is specific to that context from the Foreign Office, doing the kind of role that I used to do. The second element is supporting the family. These are emotional tragedies on a scale unlike any other consular case, and there is it is vital that we rise to meet that where we can, particularly over the duration that these cases can often take. We've all seen them play out terribly over months and years. And sustained emotional support. I mean, I've seen it with my own eyes, just what it can do to a family over a really long period of time, and it is incumbent on the Foreign Office to provide the best possible support that we can. The third element, I think, is also, particularly in those cases which run for years, is that there is almost no country in the world where we will not have other things that we also have to do during that period, whether it's secure overflight rights, secure consular access to somebody else, try to secure their votes in the United Nations for something else. And understandably, families will always feel very, very sensitive to the broader bilateral agenda that you may need to do, and worry that their loved one is not being prioritised on when other things go on. So I don't want to comment in detail on consular cases in Egypt, but that is a classic example where we have very, very difficult consular cases. Egypt is also at the very centre.
Which Blair and I both raised in the Commons.
Yeah, and I know that there are many in this room who are very focused on those cases. And you are also rightly, as we are, focused on the Arab proposals for Gaza, in which Egypt plays a central part. Yeah. Managing these complex range of relationships, one of the benefits, I think, of an envoy is to be performing an internal challenge function as well. I would like an envoy to have the ability to challenge. I mean, clearly, in the end, I will be responsible. I'm the minister. I'm accountable to Parliament. I'm the Minister for Consular Affairs and the Middle East. I cannot escape, and nor would I wish to escape that accountability. But an envoy can, I think, play an important internal challenge role, partly to provide the families confidence that in and amongst all of the other things that ministers and indeed the Foreign Office as a whole, and indeed all of us as parliamentarians will be considering, that their cases aren't neglected. So it's in those three areas that I see read across.
And sometimes it's helpful for the person of the British government who's sent there to seduce an international partner not to also be the person who's having to do the more difficult conversations on that. Exactly. Can I ask just one? Just the Foreign Secretary, when he appeared before the committee, his body language suggested that plans for an envoy were at a fairly advanced stage, but that was some months ago. Do we have a sense of timelines on appointment of an envoy yet?
Soon.
No, that's what no. No, really. The Foreign Secretary said that to us in November, soon. So since then, it's November, December, January, February, March. So we're 4 months on and it's still soon. So what's soon?
I would love to be in a position to give the committee more
We'd love you to too. That's why you're in front of us to give
I can
evidence.
tell, Chair. I will endeavour to write to you with a more specific date. The process of appointing envoys has proven it involves a number of different parts of government, so it's just taking us a little while, and I will try and get back to you as quickly as I possibly can. I'm sorry about that.
You'll get back to us soon, will you?
I will.
Well, very good. Uma.
Thank you, Chair. You've spoken, Minister, about the trauma and the grief, and having walked through Hostage Square myself, we cannot overstate the level of trauma and grief that the Israeli people are feeling. It is palpable, it's in the air. We were there on the day of the Bibas family funerals, and it was devastating. I actually walked through, there is a replica of a hostage tunnel in Hostage Square, and I walked through that, and it was just a couple of metres, and that was enough for me to want to get out of there, and cannot imagine what the remaining hostages have gone through. We also met hostages that had been released, and their testimony was so moving. What's the UK's role in ensuring that the remaining hostages are released as quickly as possible, and those bodies? Because this is one of the key points that is holding up any lasting peace deals.
Yeah. So I think particularly of Avinatan, or I want all of the hostages and all the bodies back, but Avinatan has a British mother, and so he remains a UK-linked hostage, one of the last remaining, and so we're particularly focused on his return. And his sister very movingly said to me, he's a relatively young man who was in good health when he was taken, and she very movingly made exactly the point you've just made about why does everybody think he will be fine when he's been underground for so long, and the thought of those circumstances does haunt me, the urgency with which we have got to get everybody released. The process that had been outlined to release all of the hostages was the 3 phases of the ceasefire that was set out. Now, I recognise that both parts of the Israeli government and indeed the US administration have said they wanted a more urgent timeline, and possibly in phase 1, as the Chair was asking me earlier, and we would want there to be no second of delay. We'll do everything that we can, both to try and support those efforts to get the hostage releases, but also to support those who have been released and their families. There are a number of excellent UK organisations with experience of hostage cases, and we've tried to make sure that their expertise is available to all of those who are affected by this.
We, just so that we put it on the record, we heard from Sharon Lifshitz, whose father, of course, was killed. and she gave evidence to the committee. We also, during our visit to Israel, met an extraordinary woman called Aviva Segal, who was we also saw was in the White House talking to President Trump. She was a hostage, I believe, for about 50 days, and she walked through a long tunnel, ended up having to lie on a couple of mattresses with her husband and 2 young women, and the young women were taken off and raped and abused, and how they didn't look at anyone, they didn't talk to anyone, they kept not making eye contact, trying to make themselves as small as possible. Now, she was released after about 50 days. Her husband, she had to wait 500 days before he was released, and he could hardly move because his muscles had wasted away during that time. But also his eyes didn't work because he'd been in the dark all that time. You know, these sorts of details are just heartbreaking. And then we also heard from Dalia Kuznir, who is the sister-in-law of the 2 brothers, who I believe Hamas has been particularly manipulative and brutal about, filming the one of the brothers being separated from the other, and she has got one brother back but not the other. And the bravery, and they were extraordinary women, talking about how much they were campaigning and how much the government ought to prioritise the release of the hostages and peace. And we'll remember Aviva also saying that she also thinks about the women in Gaza and what's happening to the mothers and what is the future, and holding on to that and still understanding the common humanity that everyone has, despite everything that they've been through. Was meeting them was an extraordinary experience. I don't think it's something that any of us will forget. I just wanted to just because I think we just heard that, and you know, it is important we put it on record.
I've met some of those women, and their strength, their dignity, and their bravery is sort of, I mean, honestly, words fail me. I mean, Sharon Lifshitz in particular, I've met on a number of occasions, and I mean, I would just want to record to the committee, I cannot imagine what it is that she has been through, and she is a credit to her family, credit to this country. I mean, she's been so astonishingly brave under the most awful circumstances, and my heart goes out to her and all the other families and the victims.
Yeah. I think we want to ask some questions about NGOs, and I wonder, Alex, if you would take a lead on that.
So we've heard that Israeli public opinion is very difficult at the moment, and as of course is Palestinian public opinion. You spoke a bit of, Hamish, your minister, sorry, your time in Northern Ireland, and you remember then there was a big investment in peace building by the Americans in the run-up to the Good Friday Agreement. We met lots of peace-building organisations in Israel, Palestinian and Israeli. They'd been affected quite badly by the USAID cuts in recent times, but I think now with the grand strategic level being so difficult, those sort of grassroots organisations are more important than ever. We wanted to hear more about the UK's plans for peace building in the region, and particularly the Prime Minister's commitment to an international fund to bring other countries together to invest.
Can I just ask, because I mean, what we didn't understand when we went was, given that the Prime Minister has announced this fund, or our big contribution, is going to be a major push, but then the Israelis are saying there's going to be an 80% tax. Is that going to be an 80% tax on the money that we're putting into this fund?
So I think there were 2 things. There's proposals in the Knesset for the taxation provisions around the NGOs, as you described. We're concerned by those proposals and engaging with our Israeli counterparts about them. It's very important, just on a humanitarian basis, that NGOs can operate effectively. And I'd slightly separate. You could imagine that the 2 interact, but I'll just answer the 2 questions separately, if you don't mind, Chair. There is that proposal in the Knesset of which we are aware and on which we are engaged. On the proposals for a peace-building fund, we see, exactly as you say, Alex, the vital role that grassroots efforts to try and bring the communities together can play. We are we recognise the acute sensitivity at this moment. So we're looking at these proposals very carefully to try and build an approach that will work, that will be able to navigate the deep political divergence between the two sides that Sir John was talking about, to try and ensure that our support can help enable a broader, successful effort to bridge these gaps. And it's not straightforward, so we are taking our time. The Prime Minister's been clear in our commitment, and we are going to meet that commitment. We're just working through what the most appropriate way to do that might be.
Okay, and will peace-building efforts be protected as we're approaching UK's own cuts to the aid budget?
We will continue to. I mean, peace is by far the most effective intervention in any of these situations, so it will continue to be a priority.
Thank you. And I think Blair wanted to ask about the.
Can I just get an answer to the 80% cut? I mean, if this bill passes, will this peace-building fund be subject to 80% tax?
I don't think I'm in a position for legislation which hasn't yet passed to work out whether or not a fund.
But you're making some contingency plans in case the legislation is passed.
Well, we're engaging with the Israelis about the legislation to try and make sure that our aid and that of our partners is in a position to reach Palestinians in the way that we would want, and indeed Israelis.
Okay.
Guys, is it fair to say, I mean, one of the things I think the committee has been struggling to understand is what is Britain's unique kind of offer in helping to resolve the conflict and build a better future. Is it fair to say that that experience from Northern Ireland of peace building is one of those unique contributions that we can make?
I think that is certainly one of the contributions. I think if you talk to, and you will have you will have heard directly from those in the region about how they see the UK, I would say we have had a very long-standing and close relationship, not just with Israel, not just with Jordan, not just with the Palestinians, not just with the Saudis, but with basically the whole region. And we have an excellent range of diplomats across the region, deeply steeped in the languages, the history. And I think we do have a role to play. We have a role on our own. We have a role in convening our partners, as I think you've seen repeatedly in recent months. And we have a role too because I think we have a particularly deep understanding of the threat that Iran poses to Israel, to the region, and indeed to us, is that we have been very, very clear in recent days, and indeed since we became the government, the degree to which we are prepared to take action to prevent Iran's malign activity, both here in the streets of the UK and in the region. And we ultimately want to see a region where Israel, Palestine, Saudi Arabia, the whole region is at peace with itself, and Iran is less able to exert its malign influence. And I think that is a objective that many would share, and I think we bring some unique insight and experience to that task.
Abdesam.
Thank you, Chair. You referenced earlier recognition of a Palestinian state. What are the preconditions, in your view, for recognition to take place?
We want progress. The narrow path I set out to the Chair and Sir John, to try and get to a calmer region, is one in which there are so many roadblocks, and we have relatively few strong levers, and recognition is one of them. I would like recognition to be a major contribution to advancing down that path, down that difficult and fraught path. So I don't have a set of preconditions to tell the committee that it's got to, once X, Y, and Z is met, then we will recognise. I'm clear. We want to recognise a Palestinian state. We want to see that Palestinian state able to function effectively, and we've discussed this morning a little bit about some of the impediments that could exist to its effective functioning. And we want to try and create the conditions in which international diplomacy can move forward on a two-state solution. I don't want to prejudge what those circumstances might be, other than to say I remain committed. I want to do this. I want to recognise a Palestinian state. I want to do that. as quickly as we possibly can. But I don't want to do it in the abstract. I want to do it as part of a practical contribution to moving forward.
If the peace plan leads to the June conference and countries like France and various other countries recognising Palestine, would we potentially at that point have recognition as well?
I don't want to be drawn on hypotheticals, I'm afraid, after Sam. All I'll say is I want to recognise a Palestinian state. So does the government. We want to do that as a contribution to a two-state solution, and we're looking very carefully at all of the proposals of our colleagues.
The frustration for Palestinians or anybody else watching this is that this has been said for decades, that we will continue to say we're going to recognise Palestine as part of a peace process. Decades on, we're still saying the same thing. So how do we move beyond that to actually tangible action of this is what we will do to eventually lead to the recognition of a state? So it's tangible action rather than just words, which we've been saying for decades.
So I understand the frustration, and I'm sure both the committee and many of the viewers will say, oh well, British policy has moved on recognition in a number of directions. So initially British policy was there would be recognition at the end of a process. Then the previous Foreign Secretary under the Conservatives said maybe it would happen at the beginning of a process. We're saying we want recognition as part of a contribution to moving forward, and I'm afraid I'm just not going to be drawn on what moment we might think is most appropriate.
Do you think that Israel has the right to veto recognition?
No.
Okay, so even though they voted for it in their Knesset against recognition, you think we can still move forward, potentially in the near future, recognising a Palestinian state?
I want to be clear that Israel does not have a veto on whether or not the Palestinians have a right to a state, but that in practice, a viable Palestinian state will require negotiations with Israel. Those two things are in some tension, but they're both true, which is, in the end, negotiations that can provide for the safety and security, both for a Palestinian state and the Israeli state, is going to be a vital part of this. And
recognition is conditional, and it's not an inalienable right if it requires what you've just said there. So it's a conditional right, not an inalienable right.
No, I'm clear that the Israelis do not have a veto on a state, but that practically, in order to make a Palestinian state work, you would need to have negotiations with the Israelis.
Final question from me. To what extent are our officials involved in the Arab peace plan?
We've engaged closely. I'm engaged at ministerial level, and Stephen is engaged extensively at official level as well, if you'd like to say a little bit about that.
Yeah, we've been closely engaged for over a year now with Arab countries, European partners and the United States. And in particular, we were involved in setting up a process called the Quint plus Quint, so the 5 key Western countries and the 5 key Arab states. That's met at Foreign Secretary level now 4 times, most recently in Munich. And in between those meetings, we've been engaging in particular with Egypt and Jordan as 2 of the most active Arab states on the Arab plan, on how to make that Arab plan as strong and as credible as possible. As the Minister said earlier, we have welcomed the Arab plan, and we now, in the coming weeks, want to work closely with them to make it even stronger, and in particular to give more details on the security elements of that plan. Another member of the committee spoke earlier about how important it was to reassure Israel about its security over the longer term as we seek to establish a Palestinian state. And I think that's one area where the UK can work with Arab countries to strengthen the proposals on security, whether it's around a police force, whether it's around deploying the Palestinian security forces to Gaza and how we can train and support them, or whether it's in developing this idea of an international security force in Gaza. So there's lots of work we have been doing and we'll continue to do with those Arab countries and our European partners and the US to strengthen that plan so that it's as strong and credible as possible and can lead to a permanent ceasefire.
Thanks.
Continuing on Palestine recognition, everything we saw from our visit to Israel, the rhetoric from the members of Knesset Foreign Affairs Committee when we spoke to the Deputy Foreign Minister was about the two-state solution is completely off the table. Many of them were actively talking about the annexation of the West Bank, and we saw in practical terms when we were in the Jordan Valley the steps that are being taken by extremist settlers. If we don't recognise Palestine soon, is there a risk that there won't be an opportunity for us to recognise it at all because of all these steps that Israel is taking?
We are very mindful of the questions of physical viability of a two-state solution. A two-state solution always envisaged complicated negotiations, almost certainly land swaps, a whole range of very, very difficult diplomacy in order to get it over the line. Clearly, for all of the reasons that you say, that diplomacy becomes even harder as things develop. We do not want to see the viability of a two-state solution fade into the distance. We are making those points with some force to our Israeli counterparts. I recognise what you say, Alex, that there will come a point where people lose hope in a two-state solution if there is not further progress towards it. And for all the reasons I said before, that would be very, very bad, I think, for the region, for the UK, and indeed most immediately for Israelis and Palestinians.
And at that point, might we recognise Palestine as a statement rather than as a process towards a two-state solution?
I'm sure you can tell from the thrust of what I'm saying, I don't want to do anything as a statement. I think the Palestinians and indeed hostage families, Israelis, people have had enough of statements. I want to do something that is going to make a practical difference. If we end up in a situation where statements is all we can do, then perhaps we might consider that, but that is not the world I want to end up in.
You said that you want to move away from a situation where statements are all we can do and that you want to make practical action. So, I mean, do you think that until now the British government has been engaged in the sort of practical action that has made a difference and has pushed us closer to a two-state solution? Or do you think that, in fact, what has happened is that we've made a lot of statements and no one's paid any attention?
So I thought you may ask me a question like this, Chair, about whether or not we've...
I didn't mean to, but I mean, after an hour and a half of this, it's kind of...
Yeah, well... So it is clear from everything that has been said over the last hour and a half that there are many areas where we, the government, are deeply frustrated, where we're making statements we would not wish to make about developments in Israel-Palestine. Does that mean that we are having no influence on what is happening on the ground? I don't think so. And the answer I'll give you now, well, I'm sure perhaps to you and to many of the viewers, seem very small given the stakes at play about the much bigger questions of a two-state solution and the future of the region. But I do think that the work that we have done since we became the government has made a difference, whether it's the efforts that we took in August at the Security Council to try and ensure that there was a pause in fighting for polio vaccinations, which did indeed happen, whether it was the temporary relaxations that allowed for more aid in, whether it's the painstaking work to get the 511 people with UK links out of Gaza, including a family of 3 just a few days ago, whether it's some of the other efforts that we have taken to try and ensure that hostage families are supported. This is not easy. It is not a record I'd like to be telling you about. I would much prefer to be telling you about positive progress on a whole range of bigger questions. It is, of course, incredibly welcome, and we should underline how welcome it is that we are in a ceasefire, that we're still in a ceasefire. All of the difficulties that you outlined at the outset clearly pertain. I want to see us in phase 2, and we're clearly not there yet. I do not think that our efforts, or indeed the efforts of the officials on the ground, are for naught. I know and have met many of those whose lives have been changed profoundly for the better by the action of UK diplomacy, but it is clearly not yet the situation that we would like to see in Israel and Palestine.
Just going back to the Arab plan, we heard some frustration when we were in the West Bank about how the Arab plan was being developed without a Palestinian voice at the table. And we often use the formulation, nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. Does the equivalent not apply here too?
So Rich, I think that we see the Palestinian Authority, the legitimate voice of the Palestinians, as a very important part and party to all of these discussions. And indeed, when I discussed the Arab plan before it was announced, I did so both with the relevant Arab ambassadors and indeed with Dr. Sam Zomlot as well. So we recognise the force in what you say. The Palestinian Authority does need to be reformed. There are varying regional views about how that reform might go about, as I'm sure the committee heard during their visit, but clearly Palestinian voice about a Palestinian future is very important.
Uma.
Thank you, Chair. We've been talking about the recognition of the state of Palestine. There is a real risk here that there will be nothing left to recognise very soon. We are seeing the annexation of the West Bank in front of our eyes. We've seen huge swathes of Gaza reduced to rubble. They've cut electricity, they've cut supplies. There'll be nothing or no one left to recognise soon. So I understand that the government says we'll do it at the opportune moment, but that moment may be too late. And it's not a question, it's just something that I'd like to leave you with, Minister, to keep that in mind.
Blair.
Can I bring it down from the big summits to the experience of, sort of Palestinian children? When we were in the region, we were sort of told about hundreds of thousands of Palestinian children who sort of deeply traumatised psychologically. Obviously, there's a large number of Palestinian children also with pretty horrific injuries. I wonder what support can we give, both kind of psychological and medical, to make sure that those kids get the help they need to recover from the last 18 months.
Yeah. Well, I've seen some of those children for myself. So I think there are three elements to this. The first is clearly the circumstances for children in Gaza who, like every other civilian in Gaza, we've said, we've talked about some of the restrictions on aid and the restrictions on energy and what the effect of that might be. I don't want to give the impression that what is happening in Gaza, despite all of the aid that we have provided, is adequate. There are clearly profound risks. We are working, as I just alluded to try and ensure that those who need to leave Gaza for urgent medical reasons are able to do so. And I travelled to the Al Arish Hospital in the Sinai in Egypt to see some of those Palestinian children being treated in the region. And I was pleased to announce £1 million for the Egyptian World Health Organization, where children have been able to leave Gaza for either Egypt or Jordan or other places in the region. We are working to try to ensure that, both through our funding to UNRWA, to WHO and others, that there is proper care for those deeply affected children. And if you'll permit me, Blair, I might just address this to Abdesam, because she has asked me this question repeatedly. We will also support Project Pure Hope in a very small number of cases to help Gazan children leave Gaza and get access to medical treatment here. There are few cases where that is going to be the most appropriate intervention. Most Gazan children will need to be looked after in Gaza. A smaller number will need to be looked after in the region. For a very small number, there will be a medical case for them to be treated here. And I don't want to raise the committee's expectations about this, but in a small number of those cases, the UK will work with Project Pure Hope to ensure they get assistance here.
Good. And has anybody got any other questions on Israel and Palestine? I think Alex is going to ask a couple of questions about Syria.
Yes. Thank you, Minister.
Surprise.
And thank you for your statement in the House yesterday. So we're obviously hearing about the terrible attacks that happened last week, where many Alawites have been massacred. But at the same time, we're hearing positive news about the government in Syria, the SDF cooperating with HTS, the PKK potentially ceasing their attacks on Turkey. With all of this flux happening at the moment, what is the UK's role? And should we be spending more time in Syria? I know our envoy has visited a couple of times, but it feels like that there is an opportunity for us to be there more often, potentially with reopening our embassy.
Stephen is the mastermind expert on the logistical questions about reopening the embassy, not least given he has served there before. Let me just answer some of the broader questions about Syria policy, and then I'll ask Stephen to say a bit about our presence there. So clearly, as we discussed in the House yesterday, the reports of violence on the coast and the death of minorities is very concerning. But as you say as well, Alex, there is progress being made towards a more stable Syria, I hope. I hope that progress will prove to be sustainable, and we will do everything that we can to support it. It was one of the reasons why I travelled to Turkey last week, in order to have those discussions. The elements in relation to the SDF that you describe are particularly welcome. Nobody wants to see a disintegrating Syria. Nobody wants to see further violence. The violence that we have seen has been deeply, deeply unwelcome, and the sign that a range of communities in Syria are being able to make agreements with Damascus in order to provide for their common future is welcome. The progress that I discussed in the House last night in relation to the destruction of chemical weapons is deeply welcome. I mean, I know many in this room will remember the awful scenes of chemical weapons being used in Syria by Assad. And so that progress is very much to be welcomed. This is a deeply delicate balance. Stephen has travelled to Damascus and is engaged on a daily basis on the questions in Syria, as am I. And I'd want to reassure the committee that there is, of course, rather a lot going on internationally at the moment, but Syria remains a very, very, very significant issue for the Foreign Office, and we remain quite focused on it. I might just ask you, Stephen, to say a little bit about our presence, our embassy and our visits.
Yes, I mean, first, as the Minister said, we were the first Western country to engage diplomatically with the new Syrian authorities in December, and we've kept up regular contacts and a regular pattern of visits by our envoy and by other senior officials since December. On the question of a physical presence, we no longer have an embassy building in Damascus. We gave up the lease on that building after we were forced to withdraw in 2012, but we do have an ambassador's residence, which we have made use of during the regular visits. We're looking to increase the frequency of those visits and also the amount of time that visiting officials and ministers can stay in Syria. Obviously, we're very concerned about the security situation for Syrians around the country, but also for visiting diplomats and ministers. So we pay very close attention to that and consult with our allies who are in a similar position. But we would hope to re-establish a permanent embassy in Damascus as soon as we practically can and as soon as it is safe to do so.
That's soon.
Yes.
Continuing on Syria, we've also seen recent attacks by the IDF on sites throughout the country, which I think many of us would agree would be quite destabilising at a time whilst the Syrian government is making these positive steps and saying the right things to the international community. Has the UK government made any representations towards the Israeli government about these attacks?
We are discussing Syria with the Israelis. It is very important that the new Syria is given the best possible chance to be a stable and secure neighbour to all of its neighbours, including Israel. And clearly the actions of Syria's neighbours will affect very significantly that trajectory. So we're having that discussion with the Israelis.
Iran?
Yes, let's move on to Iran.
Thank you. Minister, you've already referred.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Oh, no, I'm just being told I've missed Phil. I'm so sorry, John. This is becoming a pattern. You were going to ask some questions on Syria as well, I believe.
Yes.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. We had a one-off inquiry evidence session in January on Syria, and the last British ambassador, Simon Collis, came and gave evidence to us. And one of the topics of discussion was about the detainee camps, especially for Daesh fighters, and some of the harrowing conditions as well for women and children in the camps. What access has the government got to those camps, and what assurances have we been able to obtain about security in light of ongoing jailbreaks and potential for fighters to be able to get out of those camps?
I might ask Stephen to come in just a second. On the camps, we, for the reasons that Stephen says, we do not, I want to be clear, we do not have consular access into Syria at the moment, so we are not able to provide a consular service to the small number of British nationals who are in those camps in, I'm sure, as you say, very difficult conditions. We deal with each consular request that we get from British nationals in those camps on a case-by-case basis and deal with it very carefully indeed, given the acute difficulties in northeast Syria and some of the reports that you mentioned. We will continue to be looking at this issue closely. The announcements that Alex has referred to between the SDF, who clearly have control over those camps, and Damascus only came out last night, so there will be we will need to identify what the consequences of that announcements will be for the circumstances in the camps. The camps clearly have a large number of people in and around them who are associated with ISIS, and I want to be clear that we remain very focused on the potential terrorist threat emanating from within Syria and the wider region, and we will do everything necessary to ensure that it does not pose a threat to the UK or UK nationals. Stephen, is there anything you'd like to add?
I might just add that obviously, as the Minister said, the security of those camps and prisons is of utmost concern to us, and we recognise the risks given the changes that have happened in Syria and that are ongoing. We have a very close dialogue with the SDF on this topic. We have also spoken to the HTS leadership in Damascus about the importance of providing security in the prisons and the camps. In addition, we recognise that the vast majority of individuals in both the camps and the prisons are either Iraqis or Syrians. And we've worked very closely with the Iraqi government to support them as they seek to take back more Iraqi prisoners and individuals in the camps, working closely with the United Nations and the IOM in this regard. We also understand that the new authorities in Damascus are keen to find ways to repatriate and reintegrate Syrian individuals from camps into Syrian society over the longer term. So it's a very complex problem. We're working closely with our partners in the global coalition as well in support of the Iraqi, Kurdish and Syrian authorities to achieve this.
There are women in those camps who, at the very least, left Britain as British citizens, who may have been stripped of their British citizenship since and told that they should use the other citizenship that they, it is said, have. Obviously they haven't, in that they're still in the camps. Are you under any pressure from Syria to reintegrate those women back into Britain? I mean, I speak because one of them's a constituent of mine, and I wondered if where we were, because it seems on the face of things as though there's been very little movement for quite a long time, and that everybody is stuck. And we hear, some of the evidence we heard was about how insecure, in fact, those jails are, and how there have been jail breaks. That's largely the men, but I'm particularly focused on the women and their children, and obviously their children are completely innocent.
I'm glad that the Foreign Office has been able to repatriate a large number of British children that were in those camps. There is, and I recognise that one of them is your constituent. This is a relatively small number of people who are left, but we are very focused on those who have British links, whether they hold British nationality at the moment or did in the past. This is obviously partly a question for the Home Office, and Stephen might be able to shed a little light on the latest.
As the Minister said, we have been able to take back a number of individuals. Obviously, in looking at those cases, ministers consider a number of issues, including the security-related aspects, and we'll continue to do everything we can to provide a long-term solution to those camps. But as I said, working in particular with the new Syrian authorities and the Iraqi government and the Kurdish regional government in Iraq and the Kurdish authorities in the northeast, who all have an important role to play.
Thank you. I appreciate it's a fast-moving situation and there's limited clarity, but we've seen some really shocking videos this weekend of some of the violence. What assurances can the Foreign Office give us that you're working to ensure the safety of religious and ethnic minorities there? And are we emphasising this with discussions with HTS or whoever it is that we're speaking to in Damascus and in Syria?
We are. We're emphasising the vital. I think I said in the chamber yesterday that the violence is clearly a threat to minorities in Syria, but it's also a threat to the future of Syria. It's a place with great diversity. A functioning Syria is one in which minorities feel safe. That has always been the nature of a successful Syria. We're making that point both to the interim authorities, and we are, of course, speaking to those affected by the violence as well in order to understand their perspective. Clearly, as you say, it's a fast-moving situation. It's important to try and get real clarity about how this violence started, how it then continued, and whether or not it has indeed fully stopped, as there are some reports that suggest that it has. But we're, as you would expect, we remain focused.
John.
Thank you. Finally, Minister, you referred earlier to Iran's malign influence in the region and their involvement in the attacks on Israel, both directly and through proxies. On the one hand, we've been told that Iran has been severely weakened by the destruction in Gaza of Hamas, Hezbollah, Houthis, but at the same time there are reports that Iran has progressed quite rapidly in acquisition of nuclear weapons, with reports from the International Atomic Energy Authority. How concerned are you about that, and what are we going to do about it?
We do not want to see Iran secure a nuclear weapon. That is a priority for us. We note reports from the new US administration that they want to see a negotiation to ensure that Iran does not nuclearize, does not get a nuclear weapon, and we would support that. Along with France and Germany, we have an important role in relation to the snapback of sanctions, which would happen this year if nothing is done with the expiry of the JCPOA. We want to see a negotiation that will prevent Iran accessing nuclear weapons, which would be a threat to the region and would be viewed very seriously indeed by the UK. And we'll work with the US, the E3 and others to try and ensure that that negotiation happens and is successful.
Are you confident that it can be achieved through pressure and diplomatic means without resorting to military action?
I hope so.
Obviously, that is our intention, but are we intending to take, therefore, much stronger diplomatic and economic, perhaps, pressure?
I don't want to provide too much of a running commentary, but we're taking steps in order to try and ensure that a negotiation happens and that negotiation would be successful. We recognise the acute difficulties, but we think a negotiated settlement which prevents Iran getting a nuclear weapon is the right step.
That's it. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for being so generous with your time and dealing with our questions with the amount of care that you have. We do appreciate it. This is obviously an issue of, as I said at the outset, of huge importance internationally to us and to our constituents. And I hope that those watching have found it as enlightening as we have. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.